Welcome to ELT in Chile, a podcast about teaching English in Chile. I'm Daniel Gwynn.
And I'm José Luis Poblete. And starting this month, we're interviewing a guest in addition to the episodes twice a month.
We have wanted to have guests on our podcast or interviews with people of some type starting 2 or 3 months ago, but then something called COVID-19 happened. We are aware that there are many more voices out there besides those of two males, so this is our first ever video episode with a guest.
So our guest name is Tina Getachew. She's a government relations specialist living in Washington, D.C. She lived in Santiago, Chile for 3 years, working at a Chilean think tank, then transitioned to teaching English in Chile.
Welcome to the show, Tina. Thank you for being here.
So, of course, we have many questions for you, Tina. So are you ready for all the questions?
Ready, Jose Luis.
Very good, very good. So the first question would be, Tina, why did you move to Chile?
I moved to Chile initially because I've had like a lifelong dream to live overseas after studying abroad in college. And I thought about it for about a year. I had a strong desire to leave, and my work was kind of stalling in Congress. They weren't compromising anymore, and my idea was, well, by the time I get back, things will get better on Capitol Hill. And of course, that has not happened. It's only gotten worse. But I figured then was a good time to go and fulfill a lifelong dream.
There you go. So you moved here to Chile, and what was your experience like finding work?
Well, I started out at a Chilean think tank, but as far as getting employed, it was a bit of a challenge because I discovered after moving that we being expats would need sponsors to work legally in Chile. And that was a bit of a conundrum because the place I was interning at wasn't prepared to offer a sponsorship for me. And that's when I decided to look at teaching English classes. I realized that since I was a native speaker and I had an advantage and a privilege, you might say, of being a native English speaker in Chile, I knew that many Chileans were seeking specifically native English speakers for classes, and I decided to give that a try. And once I started advertising my services, I started to get many students for private classes. And so that became my main source of income while I was in Chile.
Well, and what, was it difficult for you to, let's say, go through that visa process? Was it, let's say, did you have to?
Oh, gosh. Oh, you guys know Chileans, paperwork, bureaucracy at its finest. And, the U.S. has a lot of bureaucracy as well, but my mother was so mad at me because I had her go, and I'm originally from Dallas, Texas, and the Chilean consulate's in Houston, and then there was the Secretary of State in Austin, and so my mom had to ship things to my aunt in Austin to get my diploma certified, which is required by Chile for residency. And then when I tried to do the work visa route through my last job, I tried to do it through thinking the Spanish word, the English word is journalist, and trying to fulfill it that way. That was, I would get to the certain level and then it would stall, and I just became so exasperated. And it was actually part of the reason why I moved back to the U.S. I just couldn't get it done. So to answer your question, Jose Luis, yes, it was complicated for me to get a work visa in Chile.
Very good. So yeah, I don't know, Jenny, do you have a question you want to go ahead or?
Yeah, and I mean, I was just going to say that I could relate to those difficulties. I mean, when I came here, I came on a student visa, and then I made the transition to a temporary residency visa and then permanent residency. And I remember that what I had to do was I had to get my college degree notarized in the state in which I received it. So now I'm from New Jersey, but I studied in California. So I had to get a limited power of attorney granted to a friend of mine in order to go to a notary in order to get that taken care of. And actually thinking about it, she's African American, and she had a very difficult time finding a notary that would do that service, even though she had the limited power of attorney and she had all the proof and everything. In the end, it worked out. But yeah, the bureaucracy of getting a work visa here or, any type of visa, it can be very, very daunting.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean,
and
yeah.
to add to that, I also went to, my undergrad was in New York. So I was also going from New York to Texas for the same reasons that Dan mentioned. And it was exhausting. And I think my mom was over me for about a month. She didn't want to talk to me for about a month after it was done. So, yeah, things that you learn once you're overseas, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most difficult things. I also lived abroad. I lived in Belgium for some time when I studied there. So yeah, that visa process. Yeah, I think it took me a couple of months before actually going to Belgium to get my student visa, and the amount of paperwork was enormous. Even going to the embassy doctor, for I had to go to the only doctor that was allowed. Let's say registered to work with the Belgian embassy. So yeah, I understand. I mean, and I don't. Well, let's say the government has tried to make this process better, but I don't think it has really improved that much.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
this is so interesting that we have all these different experiences, visas, different countries, and things like that. So, getting back to our topic, I was wondering what your experience is like as a teacher, and also being a native speaker of English, teaching English in Chile.
So that question elicits a lot of feelings and a lot of responses because each student you have is different, as you guys well know. I will say that starting out, it wasn't, I found a way to advertise my services online, and that ended up being the way to get students. So I had students calling me, and just getting to that step took a little bit, but with my Chilean friends, they helped me put the word out. I had students in the beginning that were committed, and it was great. I noticed that I think my second year in, some students weren't as committed, and then you would get some students that wanted for a couple of months. And just coming from the US and that mentality of saying, I'm going to be here at this time, this is the class that I want, and I will show up. I was expecting that. And then after a year, and I realized that the Chilean culture is just different. It's just different. And as a teacher, you have to learn to adapt. And I had to realize also that I am in their country, right? And so I had to adapt to what the customs were there. And that includes being a teacher as well. And I had to institute policies as far as payment in advance and things of that nature. I will say that I had wonderful students who I would have lunch when they would invite me lunch with their whole families. So some students I met their entire families. I still keep in touch with them. 3 years later, 4 years later. Some of them, when my mom came to visit, they invited her over as well. So my mom had met some of my students. So I really made actually some lifelong friends through this that I didn't expect to make in being a teacher in Chile.
I can definitely relate to that. Yeah, it sounds like you had a really nice experience. And yeah, I think this is one thing that is difficult, dealing with different cultures, different expectations, things like that. But I think the one thing as a foreigner is realizing that we are visiting Chile, or we are the guests in Chile. We're the ones choosing to live here. So we need to adapt to the culture, or we need to communicate our expectations clearly to students.
And sometimes it's not in the adapting of cultures. Sometimes it's not just the schedule commitment, it's also making yourself available for the students. For example, when a student would invite me to have a meal after the class, and if I was planning to do something else with my day, I would try to accommodate them because I realized this is a way of establishing a relationship with them. And also just the fact that they're offering to give me more of their time as well as their food, which was always great, might I add. I had great cooks and students. I realized that, and as far as adapting and reciprocating cultural wise, it's important for you to make time for them as well. And of course, if I had a class afterwards or stuff, we would just schedule it for another time. But that's something else that I learned to do that you wouldn't necessarily think of doing if you worked and lived in the US. There's a bit of a barrier as far as work and personal relationships that kind of dissipates when I was living in South America.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
a
So yeah, that's very interesting. And also, I mean, you were saying that, let's say it was not really difficult for you to get students because, let's say, there was like word of mouth, like it was basically done or set up in that way for you to find work as a teacher. You didn't
And
have to
also
ever.
because I was a native speaker, because my
Uh-huh.
Chilean friends pointed out to me in the beginning, you need to put that in the, why am I thinking Spanish more than English now? Anuncio in the
And I
flyer.
know.
They said you need to put that in there. And me, when I first came, I was like, why is that really important? They said, trust me, this is what you need to do. And it was true. So I realized that was a privilege that I had being a native speaker. I'm sure that if it was a Chilean person who also spoke English fluently, that they may not have had that amount of success in the beginning.
And Tina, you made a really good point. You thought that it was not important. Why do you think, let's say for you, why was that not really important, and why do you think it was for the students?
Well, now I see why, but initially I just didn't really think about it. I guess it was still kind of adapting to another culture, right? So I think I would say that it's part of that. But then I think about it, if you do want to learn English, then you want to incorporate the accent as well. And though I did mention Chileans who had flawless English, so I think there's a little bit of um, maybe, I don't know if it's stereotype or discrimination against Chileans who actually could do as well as that I could do. So, and like I was alluding to earlier, it is a form of privilege because a Chilean teacher may have had just as much experience and as much education to offer as I did, but because I had a native speaker part of my bio, then I was attracted to more people. And I remember even when I was leaving Chile, that my students were asking for people another teacher, and they specified someone who was a native English speaker.
Moving on to our next topic. Did you experience any culture shock in Chile? And if so, what was that like?
I will allude to what I mentioned earlier as far as keeping commitments. I remember when I first started working at the think tank, that's as soon as I moved to Chile, I was there the first week. And I made some friends with my colleagues there. And I remember we were supposed to go to a museum to see Michael Jackson's Thriller jacket. It was in a museum in Santiago. And I was so excited. I said, okay, let's do this. And so my colleague said, oh yeah, we'll go Saturday, no problem. And then Saturday came. And then he said, no, I can't do this Saturday. We can do next Saturday. And then the next Saturday came and went. And I did not realize that if I wanted to see Michael Jackson's Thriller jacket, that I would have to either go by myself or go with someone else. So I learned that Chileans don't really like to say no. They like to throw out things, but they don't really like to say no. They can't do it. So that's something I had to learn culture-wise. And I remember something else that I was told in the beginning was to calm down, because not only am I American, I came from Washington, D.C., where everyone is type A to the T. And when I moved to Chile, they would always tell me to calm down. This project will get done eventually. And I just remember the first month, how many times they told me, to the point where I was like, I don't need you telling me to calm down. I got it. Okay. So, and then it's funny, you fast forward 2 years, and I had a friend visit me from here, and she said, wow, you just seem so much more calm now. And I said, well, I had to. I live in South America. What are you going to do? So it was a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. Initially, it was a challenge, but then I kind of got around to it. And another thing that I picked up is and it was a culture shock as well. And it kind of dovetails with this, is that I learned that in the end, things will turn out okay on its own time. And that's something that I've actually taken with me even after I left Chile. And because ultimately things worked out when I was in Santiago. I had a lot of interesting moments in life, and I just knew that I was like, this is going to end well, some way, somehow. Maybe next week, maybe next year. And it did. And so that's something that I adapted to. But the timing thing and the schedule thing was the first thing I remember was a culture shock for me. And now I know.
I can also
So,
relate to that. Yeah. And I think that, when we're in the United States, we're so organized. We're so, on top of our schedules. We're on time. You don't have to confirm things the day before. You just know it's
yeah,
going to
the
happen.
confirmation thing. Yeah. I
Uh,
mean, why do we have to confirm coffee tomorrow? It's in my schedule. Is it not in yours? And then I
yeah.
learned that I needed to confirm everything from now on.
Yeah.
So,
And it still happens to me every once in a while where I don't confirm something the day before. And, then I'm like, and then, someone doesn't connect on Zoom or, or, one thing or another. And then I'm like, oh, I forgot to confirm. I'm going to have to see if they're, if they're showing up or not. And
you know,
then I kind of feel like it's my fault that I didn't confirm with them. So I feel like I've kind of become Chilean in this.
yeah. Well, it's interesting that now I feel like Americans are becoming Chileans in this with this pandemic. Everybody has more relaxed schedules, right? And so
Mhm.
I will say, hey, let's get on a Zoom call tomorrow at 3, right? And then I realize that now I have to confirm with people because even though they're around, they just don't put it in their agendas or in their calendars. So it's interesting to see how people's behavior changes, and it's starting to remind me a little bit of my Chilean friends.
Your experience
So
here
now I'm
with
starting to confirm again.
yeah, but that's very interesting. I mean, like I think most people who are foreigners, some of my friends who let's say have visited Chile or who have been living here, they complain about that. Like confirming or saying like, okay, so but oh, like you can also say no, and for them it was let's say I mean for Chileans it's really hard to say no, and but also like you said let's say the one of the positive things like things work out in the end like I don't know why or how but way they all turned out to be let's say good.
Yeah, one more thing that I picked up, it wasn't a culture shock, but it took me, I had to get used to it, is that when I would text someone, people always open with, hola, ¿cómo estás? Right? And here, if I want to talk to my cousin, I'm like, hey, I need this, da, 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 this, da, this, da, this. Like, that's just how we talk here. And I learned to start with the hola, ¿cómo estás? If not, you
Yeah.
take, because I had a Chilean tell me, hey, I think you need to start with the greeting. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's something that I do. And so now that I'm back, I've kind of gone back to my own American ways. But when I talk to my Chilean friends, I make sure to start out with hola, ¿cómo estás? And then I'll send a video or a picture of whatever it is
Yeah, like to provide some context or like to
yeah.
make
So I learned to be more
person
polite is what I'm trying to say in a long-winded fashion.
And I think that this is one thing that's really interesting too, because I think that we have, like cultural competency, and communication with people from other cultures, communicating effectively to get what you need, because if you were to do that in the States, maybe that isn't necessary. Maybe you're working with people that really value their time and they just want to say, okay, just let me know what you need. And, that might be the way you need to communicate with people in that context. So, yeah, I think I can definitely relate to what you were commenting on. What did you want to say, Jose Luis?
No, I think that's that example was let's say really accurate. Also because I see it. Let's say some of my friends from the US, they just say like, hey, this is what I need, and my Chilean friend, they would just send this long text just to ask me for the same thing. Hola, ¿cómo estás? How's your family? How's everything? How have you been? Can you, do you have some time so maybe I could borrow that book that we I don't know talked about last week? So you could just say that. You don't have to send me 10 questions before.
And I think that this is one thing. Oh, sorry. I think this is one thing that where I think there's a difference with view of the culture, because I think in the United States, if you're writing to someone and you're asking all these questions and things like that, and then if you put the request at the end, it sounds like you're buttering them up to ask them for something. Whereas what I've read is that if you do have to contact someone and maybe you haven't been in contact with them a while, you might say, hey, how's it going? I hope you're doing well. I'm writing to you with this favor. If you're able to help me, great. But if you can't, don't worry. And then if you indicate something afterwards, like, I know we haven't been in contact for a while, but I hope your family's doing well. If there's anything I can do to help you out, please let me know. So it kind of like you're putting it in the front, right? But you're showing that genuine interest in them afterwards. Whereas in Chile, it seems like it's a little bit inverted.
Yeah.
And one thing that I didn't mention is that my family's Ethiopian. And actually, when you talk to an Ethiopian person, it's the same way as the Chilean version. When you call someone on the phone, you ask them how their family's doing, and then 5 minutes later, you get to what the ask is. So it's interesting that even though I was raised in a certain culture, the American system kind of became my dominant form as far as cultural adoption. So it's interesting, and I didn't really realize that till right now. So that's something more to think about on my end.
Excellent.
So maybe we can move on to the next question, Daniel. So, Tina, what was your experience like as a Black female in Chile? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I will separate the Black and the female.
Very good.
And I'm going to reasons why I will do that. As a Black person in Chile, many Chileans, my neighbors, for example, they knew I was American because I lived in Ñuñoa. There weren't many foreigners in my building. In fact, there wasn't any. It was just me. So everyone knew me as the American. And yes, I was Black, but I was the American. So the American kind of was the forefront, right? And when I would visit friends that were American, for example, or even if they weren't, the person at the security desk knew me as an American, just saying my name, Tina, right? And and how I looked, right? I didn't really look Chilean in this Afro-Chilean, yes, but there weren't that many in Santiago from what I remember. And so I would get buzzed in, and something that wouldn't really happen if I was living here in the US as a black person, period, where you get a second once over if you want to go through security and things are a little bit more difficult. In Chile, I was just seen as an American. And yes, I was Black, but I was an American. And there weren't any other questions as far as, oh, she's American, that's it. Like, they didn't even ask what state I was from or anything. It's like, oh, she's American. So I was seen as this elevated status, even though I was American. And I had qualms with that as well. And I definitely got into circles that I know I would not have been if I hadn't been American, because I was described as the Norteamericana before my name sometimes, and that irked me a bit, and that's definitely a form of privilege as well. So that is how I would see, and if Chileans saw me on the street, they would look at me just because I didn't look Chilean, but there wasn't anything as far as the Blackness goes, from what I interpret, from what I took. Initially, it took a little getting used to as being in Ñuñoa and getting the looks, but then I realized again, which we talked about before, I'm living in a different country. They're not really used to seeing people that look like me, especially in Ñuñoa. Even when I left, it was still I remember the guy at the kiosk would always call me La CIA because he thought that I was working CIA, and I was like, dude, why would I live in the kiosk? He always called me Tina, and I love that. I would see him once a week. He was a great guy, and we would shoot the breeze. But yeah, so that is how I was viewed as a Black person in Chile. As a female, it was different. The misogyny that I encountered as a teacher, let alone in any other aspect, I will say as a teacher, as teaching English in Chile was something that was a challenge. I usually had a harder time with my male students as far as keeping commitments, as far as payment, and when I would be resolute about, hey, you know what the protocol is, like changing my schedule to accommodate their schedules, that tended to happen a lot. And then if I couldn't do it, like I would get a call Sunday morning sometimes for a class that day when they know that I don't work on Sundays.
Mhm.
And I started to see for what it was. Initially, I was like, oh, come on, this guy knows the deal. But then I started to see how I was being treated. And then when I stood firm and held my ground, then they would no longer have classes with me. And so that became a recurring thing with my male students. And I did not like that. So I will say, it was actually, as an English teacher, it was tougher for me as being a female more than anything else. And you would hear things when you talk with Chileans in general, as well as the machismo is very much alive in the work setting as well. My fellow expat friends would tell me about working in Chilean offices and what they have to deal with from their supervisor and their bosses or even their colleagues. So that is why I wanted to separate the Black and female, because those are two aspects of my life in Chile that needed to be separated when answering this question.
Absolutely. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think that I've also seen, I obviously haven't experienced it being female, but I have seen things. I have heard very inappropriate comments about female teachers and things being said at offices. And I do know that in some institutes, they will receive requests for teachers that are gringa. And they specify they would like a female teacher as opposed to a male teacher. You know, so I think that Chile's a wonderful country. It's a wonderful culture. No culture is perfect. I think that's one of the negative things that unfortunately, happens. I do want to backtrack a little bit with what you were saying about, being in the CIA and things like that and known that way and being buzzed in. So, Tina, when you were living in Ñuñoa, I was also living in Ñuñoa, and you would come over and visit me from time to time. We'd hang out at the pool, play video games and things, and we had some games of Catan, and things from time to time. And you even watched
my I never had a problem getting into your building either. Like when I would house sit for you, I would just walk right in. I would say, hey, I'm here for 202. I remember that was your apartment number, wasn't it? 2002?
2002.
And then, 2002. And then they would give me your mail and I would go up. That was it. And I know there was one guy that we knew well, but even when it was someone else, I could just take your mail and go up. That was, there was no proof of identification or anything.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the thing is, I did always leave a letter with them and things, and I think they got to know you after they saw you. So there was that trust, and I think the other thing is when I was away and when you watched my place, there was one guy in particular who said, "Oh, Tina Turner está."
Yes, that is always how I say my name. All the time I say Tina como la cantante, because they'd be like, la Tina Turner, and I'm like, yeah.
There you go. Exactly.
Yeah, but I think what you just mentioned, I mean, going back to that story, let's say, of lots of machismo here. Yeah, I mean, that's difficult, even though there has been a change, but I do think that still happens, and that's not good. People in positions of power, tend to do that, let's say, or tend to behave like that, towards women, and that's not okay. But yeah, that's why I think it makes complete sense when you try to separate, because some of my friends, let's say, who are also Black, they haven't had any issues, and maybe they thought that they were going to, but it was, like you said, it was basically based because maybe they were American, or everybody thought that they were American. Some of them were, let's say, British. So it was, let's say, more difficult in that sense than that because they were, for example, all pulled in. I mean, all let's say put in this huge pool of everybody was American, and that was the main problem because people had, let's say, have a lot of problems to let's say differentiate people from many countries. So they just tend to let's say generalize, and that's, let's say, the main difficulty that I see.
Definitely. I think I've seen that also. I had a coworker who was Asian American. And so when he would go out in public, people would say, "Oh, mira, el chino." And they would assume that he was Chinese when he was actually Korean.
Yeah.
And so I think that for Chileans to make that distinction of, beyond just like Asian, Black, white, gringo, gringa, things like that, I think that they just don't typically make those distinctions. At the same time, if you were to say to them, oh, Chilean, Peruvian, Argentinian, Venezuelan,
They're
it's
the
all the same,
same.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then you see their eyes
They'll
get wide.
they'll get offended, right?
Yeah. So then I think that once you say it that way, then they kind of get it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Tina, how long was it that you lived in Chile, and what was the range of dates that you were here?
I moved to Chile on Ash Wednesday, March 6th of 2014. And it was the day actually that I left my job. So I worked until the very end. And then I was saving those dollars. And then I returned July 2nd of 2017 because I wanted to make it in time for July 4th in the US. I came back to DC. I was like, up. So it's interesting when I meet people now and they ask, how long have you been in DC? Because nobody in DC is really from DC. I'll say, oh, overall, 13 years. And then sometimes they follow up with, well, where were you for the 3 years? And sometimes they don't. And then if I say Chile, they're like, what? So it's interesting. It's far. And I show them where it is on the map because people don't really know where it is here. So, I bring that up. And then they always say, oh, you must speak Spanish really well. And I say, well, after 3 years, I would hope so. So, yeah. So I lived there for 3 years, 3 great years. And I should note that my parents were scared every single week. I would Skype and they would worry about me here. My mom came to visit. Dan, you remember you met her. She came to visit my 2nd year in and she had me throw a party. And this is how I know Africans are like South Americans because she says, well, I'm there. We're going to have a party. I said, okay. So I had to plan a party, my birthday party, because she came for my birthday. And she goes, so I had like 30 people come. And she met all my friends. And then after she went back to the States, she said, okay, I feel comfortable where you are now. So she just had to see my family, my community, my family, so to speak, in Chile. And she became comfortable with me living there for 2 years. So I ended up staying for another year, and I stayed for 3 years, and it was great.
Okay, yeah, talking about that, Tina, what's something you really liked about living here in Chile? What's something you
Something
liked?
I really liked is the carefree attitude of Chileans because they didn't seem to worry about anything. And that was good and bad, but it helped me learn to calm down, which I mentioned earlier. I also I was able to travel to the north and the south and to even little towns that even Chileans hadn't heard of, like Catemu. Jose Luis, have you heard of Catemu? Oh, okay. So I went there and it was a buddy of mine that lived there, and it was just great. The people are so nice, and the country is gorgeous from the north and the south. A lot of people love the south. I actually liked the north more. The desert topography just spoke to me more. And you would get herbal remedies right there on the road. There's this herb I remember when I was in San Pedro that I took. It was actually a weed that you put in with boiled water. And it actually made my stomach better. And it's just crazy how there's so many herbs and just the food tastes so much better in Chile. I remember when I would come back for Christmas and I would bite into a grape. And I remember thinking, this isn't a grape. This is lame. And just even the meat. And I would just be like, oh, no. And I would just be disgusted with American poultry and American fruits. And then I go back to Chile and I just be like, oh, this is what a mango tastes like. This is what a cherry tastes like. And so I definitely miss the produce of Chile because it was great. And and of course the people as well. So there are things that I learned, and it's just a stunning country. I always tell people to visit it, and it's just so much to see, right? It's not a place that you can really visit in a weekend. Because there's just so many different parts. So I always say when people want to go to Chile, well, what do you want to see? Because you're going to have to choose. So those are some of the things that I love and really cherish about Chile.
Very good, very good. Yeah, I mean, what you said about, let's say that, like some people, let's say, are really fond of the north, and some people, let's say, like the south more. My family is from the north, so yeah, I feel like I like the north more. So La Serena. Hawaii, so that's where my family's from.
Nice. Yes.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, I think I can relate to that also, with the food, and I think the people are very warm and welcoming. And also traveling. Yeah, I think 2 weeks you can choose either Santiago in the north or like Santiago in the
On
south.
the south, yeah, yeah,
I mean, even
absolutely.
La Serena, those is, it's not necessarily San Pedro, but it's still a place to see, right? I went
Yeah,
to Valle de Uki with a friend, and we did La Serena as well. And I remember we went to a coastal town. I forgot the name of it, but I remember getting there. It was a classic Chilean story of like, they said they'll take you on a boat, right? So we go expecting to be on a boat, and they're like, "Oh, there's no boats right now, but if you wait, it'll come. We'll see how it goes." So my friend and I just laid out over some empty boats on the beach, and I forgot the name of this place. It was stunning, but anyway, so my friend was she came from the U.S., but she was, thank God, she was laid back too. I was like, just let's just sprawl out here. So we waited about an hour, and then they finally brought a boat back, and so we were able to go, and we went out in the on the water, and there were dolphins just swimming right by us, and it was so cool. So it's just one of those things. It just, you got to just go with the flow.
Definitely,
absolutely.
definitely. There you go. So, we talked about the things you liked about living in Chile, and is there anything that you didn't like about living here?
Um, some things, the conveniences, stores not being open when the owner doesn't want it to be open, for example. It's kind of like the schedules are kind of at a whim of the owner, unless it's like a leader or something, or Unimark. And yeah, that was the biggest trial for me, just having to just go to stores when they're open, just getting something printed, getting an errand done. It has to be at a certain time, otherwise you're done for the weekend. If it's a Friday after 2, forget about it. It's not going to get printed until Monday. So things like that were a little bit challenging
I think
to.
so. Going to banks, I imagine, because banks close
The
at 4 o'clock
bank,
here.
oh my gosh, yeah, before 2. And then just charging a Metro card, you had to go to the ticket window, right, with cash in hand.
Hmm.
That was just some things like that, and were just a little exacerbating. But it was a different culture, like a different country, so you learn to adjust to it. So those
Yeah,
are the
absolutely.
trickiest, I think, the most challenging things for me as far as living in Chile. One thing about Santiago, especially, is that it's so wide. So if I wanted to visit friends, it depends on where they lived. Like me living in US, like maybe I'll go to Las Condes, but if I go to Las Condes today, I'm not going to El Centro. Like, so it's just
Hmm.
some things. It's just like it's very, very spread out. So that's more of a Santiago thing than a Chilean thing.
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
Oh,
Well,
and one thing I was sorry was the central heat.
Oh yeah.
The stufa. Oh my gosh! I remember in winter. I was like,
Yeah.
I would go to sleep with my hat on my head, and
Mhm.
you just learn to adapt.
I remember my
yeah,
first winter here, and I'm like, oh, I was looking at the temperatures. I'm like, that's not really that cold. We get weather like that
Yeah.
in New Jersey. But then you don't
Mm-hmm.
realize that it's that temperature in your bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I learned
absolutely.
really, really quick after that first winter.
Yep. And
Yeah,
you were huddled next to that stufa,
Uh-huh.
like. And I should stop saying stufa to give the audience, but like the heating unit,
Mhm.
and yeah, you're
yeah.
just right next to that thing. That thing was gold.
Yeah.
And
So
drinking tea or drinking coffee, that's like the best way for getting a nice blanket. But there, I mean, I went
yep.
living in another country where they had central heating. For me was like so comforting, walking in winter inside, with a t-shirt, and then going outside was probably, I don't know, -5 degrees Celsius. But here is like, yeah, it's not that cold. But then I'm working here on my computer, like Daniel. I usually ask him, and he's like, it's so cold today.
Yeah. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think that one thing that I'll do is when I go back to the States, I will bring some of the modern conveniences that we have back with me. And I've learned the hard way a few times with electronics that doesn't always work, even if you do use the converter and transformer. But
That's true.
things like flannel bed sheets, flannel pajamas, things like that, they really, really make a difference.
They do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you learn to adjust, right? So
Yeah,
anything that I have to say about Chile is just learning to adjust to another country.
absolutely. So should we move on to the next question, Daniel?
Sure, yeah.
So, Tina, what was it like moving back to the States then? What was your experience, let's say, when you had to go back to, did you go back to DC?
Yeah, I came back to DC and I uh I didn't I had a little bit of a shock coming back, but I think the food, the fast food that I missed kind of brought me back home. I remember my first meal being a Chick-fil-A. I said, okay, I can do this. Yes, I'm back in the US. And I have like a family here, so it was easy as far as like readjusting. Whereas in Chile, I didn't have anyone. I had roommates, but I had just met them, so it was more isolating there. So I came back here. I had a support system already ready for me. So it was just a matter of finding another job, which I eventually did, and getting back into that. And I couldn't be as laid back at work as I could in Chile. I remember in Chile during the World Cup, I remember talking to my boss. I'm like, hey, can we just not have this meeting because Brazil's playing? And I remember she's like, you said you're in South America, enjoy it. I was like, this place is amazing. And I hear I could try to sneak it in my computer, but there was no way my boss was going to give me 3 hours to go watch a soccer game, right? So,
Well, here they that's mandatory here, mandatory.
yeah, no. In Chile, you can't even get a cab if Chile's playing. I learned to learn the soccer schedule. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think particularly living in Ñuñoa, if you're near the national stadium, you
Oh,
know,
yeah.
going out or trying to come home in that traffic of a soccer game, and things like that. I think that's an issue. And I remember, yeah, that there would be like, I remember my first year here, 2010, they actually made going to school at the school that I was at optional. And so they said if kids wanted to stay home, they could stay home to watch the Chilean game. Or if they wanted to come to school, that they could then watch in the auditorium, and they were having it broadcast on a big screen for everyone to watch.
I remember I had a student who worked at a law firm and Chile was playing. And I remember this is when Chile like got all the way to the quarterfinals of the World Cup. So Chile was kicking butt. And I remember there was one game, it wasn't that one, it was one before. And all the partners in the law firm were in the room that I usually taught her in, which is a library. And I said to her, look, I'm not about to get between these guys and the TV. So do you want to cancel class or what do you want to do? So we ended up using another room. But I asked her, I was like, you're not going to watch the game? She's like, no, the guys are all going to do that. And I said, okay, cool. But it was just funny to see how even workplaces in Chile were like, this is soccer, this is going to happen. And there's no way we're going to miss this match. So that's something that I realized that you don't really see like people bonding over the U.S. national soccer team if they play in the World Cup. That's just
I mean that's something that I don't know that will be brought up here in a meeting. It's like, hey, there's going to be a game. Like in 2 weeks, so we should do something. We should buy some food. So what are we going to do? Are we going to watch it all together? Especially if it's do I don't know, on a Tuesday. I remember that happened so many times. Let's go and buy some food. So I'll buy some soda. You can buy some some chips, and then we will be watching it all together. And that's part of the schedule. And that's so funny to see, because actually, let's say in my case, I teach in 2 universities, and that happens. Students would ask me, so what are we going to do? Like, what do you mean what we're going to do? Do you want to see the game with us? And I said, of course.
Yeah, that's something great about Chile is that it's very communal, right? It's a communal society. Whereas here it's more of individualistic. And one thing I also liked about Chile that I forgot to mention is that you guys tend to be with your families on Sundays. So that's when I would usually see my fellow Americans on Sundays, because we didn't have Chilean families. So I knew they would be free on Sundays. Whereas Chilean friends, I knew that I wouldn't really get them on Sundays. But it was also cool to see that commitment that Chileans have with their families.
Definitely, I agree, and I think that this is one thing in the States, as you said, we're so individualistic, and we go off to college, we might be studying in another state, and we're really encouraged to kind of like start to become independent and separate from our families a little bit. when we go to university and, afterwards. Whereas in Chile, people stay with their family, they maintain, that contact a lot more. I think that, they continue living with family for the most part. So, you did mention that it was a little bit difficult dealing with things being so laid back in Chile and then going back to the States. And having to, take things maybe a little more seriously than you did in Chile. Did you experience any type of reverse culture shock or anything besides that element?
Um, Not really. It was just more of getting back in the groove of job searching and listen, Pituto is here too. It's not just in Chile. So I had to really work my connections. And so that was something I was like, oh, okay, it's not just in Chile, it's here too. And I knew that, but I just forgot. So it was kind of like, just riding a bike again, a bike that you hadn't ridden in 3 years. So just getting back in the groove of that as far as being accustomed back to living in the US.
Reactivating your network, getting in touch with people that using word of mouth, to get reestablished.
I remember, this is a funny anecdote. I was in an elevator and I had to been like my second month back, and I went to an event with my cousin who had lived in Peru for a while. And I remember someone came in the elevator and I could tell that he was Latino. And so I started speaking to him in Spanish just off the cuff. And the guy responded, and my cousin says to me, listen, I know you've been in South America for a while, but you don't have to go straight into Spanish with people anymore. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess not. But it was just one of those things. He was like, hey, pro tip, by the way, you could just start off in English. I'm like, yeah, I guess that's true.
I mean, because I think this is one thing that happens where people, and I know this happens with people in the United States, when they see someone that looks Latino, they assume that they speak Spanish. But that's not always the case.
That's true too. And so I took what he said to heart because I thought about that as well. And yeah. And I just wanted to keep speaking. I wanted to practice too. But yeah, there's that level as well. Like he could have not been a Spanish speaker.
Yeah.
So I know he could have been Latin, just not spoke Spanish. So
yeah,
that's something that I just kind of had to adjust as far as coming back. It's like not going straight into it like I normally would have. And also when I did speak Spanish with people here, the majority here like from Honduras or El Salvador, so I had to speak Español neutro. So I had to drop all my Chilenismos, which was hard to do because Cachay is so catchy. And but that wouldn't be they wouldn't really understand that. So I had to learn to speak neutral Spanish.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, that happens to me when I talk to other people from other Spanish-speaking countries,
exactly.
have to adjust.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think, I have another question for you, Tina. What do you think about the current situation in the US regarding racism? For example, I mean, we've seen thousands of people, taking to the streets to demonstrate against racism. So what do you think about that?
I think it's really awesome to see. Dan and I mentioned before how the US tends to be an individualistic society. So the fact that these protests are bringing people together and still doing it now, 3.5 months later, is remarkable, if not incredible. I can't think of any other movement in the US that's lasted this long and that's brought such attention to one specific cause, which is the fact that Black Lives Matter. And I think it's great. And it's happening right here in my backyard in Washington, D.C. It wasn't that long ago that companies wouldn't even touch the phrase Black Lives Matter. It was considered something you don't even address. And now Nike, Amazon, and everybody is stepping over toes to just post their Black Lives Matter post. So that in itself is a step that I think people, I know I understand that people want to take it to the next level, but I'm like, can we just stand back and look at this? Like the fact that my Uber Eats app is saying these are Black businesses that you can order food from. That is amazing that they're highlighting these businesses. That did not happen before. And The fact that people are sharing lists of books to read, the fact that these books on anti-racism are topping the Amazon list, the top 10 list, is incredible and heartening. So I tend to look at the positive side. I'm a glass half full kind of girl. There are other steps, of course, as far as diversity and these boards and who's actually making the decisions and the employees, and are they being taught about how to delve in more into this, and if they don't agree with it, why, and are we having these conversations with people about Black Lives Matter. I think the movement is great. I had went to visit the Black Lives Matter Plaza. That's the one with the writing of Black Lives Matter in front of the White House. I went with my friend, and so I was taking pictures of that, and they had vendors selling things, and there were signs, and there were just people out there, and it was really nice to see it. And there is more to be done. And even though I was out on the plaza, how do I say this? There is still things going on, and living in DC, you have a little bit of a different perspective in that when I went to the plaza and I did a walk around with my friend, we came back, we took a detour and we came back an hour later, and we just stopped to have ice cream. And as we were eating our ice cream, we noticed that the military Humvees were coming out on the street, and this is downtown DC. There are no battles happening in downtown DC. And the fact that the Humvees were coming out and stopping, I told my friend, I said, okay, this is time to go back home. And by then it was noon. So, and there wasn't a group forming or anything. And now this was a month ago. This is right when Black Lives Matter Plaza was formed. But so there's still friction as far as these protests are going, and you guys have seen it, what's happening in Portland as well.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky time. And it's also pandemic, right? So it's great to see people bonding together, but I also just, from the scientific view, I'm like, I wish people would be a bit more cautious. And even with that, there's the authorities and people being jailed. Like right here in my neighborhood, I had heard about people being jailed, like some protesters being jailed because they were breaking curfew when DC had a curfew. So there's a lot of different layers to what is going on now. But what I try to do is I inform my friends. Dan had called me during the height of it, and we talked about it. And I just say to people, like, the best thing that you can do as far as non-Black people go is that when it's happening in front of you, and you guys mentioned this on your podcast, your last one I listened to, is to stop it right then and there. I think the tips that you gave were really good. Just stopping the conversation right then and there, diverting it, or just making sure that it doesn't continue, having the person clarify what they're saying. And I think if people really listen to what they say as well, they might think twice of what they're actually saying. And so I think it's important to have a positive conversation, a conversation with respect. And I think what usually happens is that respect gets thrown out the window after the first 2 minutes. And we kind of just see a deterioration of what happens after that. So I think it's a lot harder to have a respectful conversation on this topic than people think. And there's many reasons behind that as well, but that's a whole other podcast.
Absolutely.
But overall, I think it's great. And I think you can never have enough awareness as far as what Black people go through, not just here, but worldwide. I mean, I mentioned I was African. There's colorism as well, amongst Africans as well. And it's something that I've recently thought about again too, and had a conversation with my parents about as well. So I think it's good. I had great talks with my mom about when she first came to the US, and something she never told me as a Black woman living in Texas until we just started talking about the movement. So it's elicited more conversations that I didn't expect to have with my parents. So I think this is something that you can have with just not your peers, but also your parents as well, or even people who are younger, who are 8 or 5. Like I have friends telling me that they're talking to their kids about racism at their 5-year-old and explaining to them, which is daunting, but I think it's important. And honestly, if you're non-Black, then you have the luxury of not addressing it until they're 5.
Yeah, I mean, at some point,
my parents told me that I asked if I was Black once I was in preschool. I asked my mom if I was Black, and that had never been addressed before in the house because why would it, right? Because we're all doing this. But it's made me realize like how I want to raise my children and what tough conversations I'll have to have
Absolutely.
earlier than expected, especially if they're Black sons. Like that's a challenging conversation. But all in all, I think it's a great movement, and I'm wholeheartedly in support of it.
Very good, very good.
Excellent. Yeah. And one thing, this really made me think of some things. One thing you said about having a respectful conversation. I mean, I think that there are people that can have different perspectives and things like that, but being able to clarify rather than jumping to conclusions. So, for example, if somebody here in Chile were to say, oh, I think it's wonderful seeing student protesters out on the street. So now protests have been associated with a lot of destruction and things. So rather than assuming they're talking about the destruction, somebody could say, well, what do you mean by that? So then the person might be of the opinion that, well, we were living under a dictatorship and people were really afraid to express their opinions about things. But now people are going out on the street and they feel that they can publicly protest. They feel like they can talk about how they feel. And I think that's a very positive thing. And then that's probably some common ground that people maybe from one side and the other side could agree on. Then, the issue of destruction of property, things like that, maybe there's some different ideas, and things like that. Maybe that's something where you might have a discussion with someone. Maybe it's a topic for the sake of, the friendship, the relationship. Maybe you just don't talk about that topic, but yeah, I think that being able to listen to people with different perspectives, I think that's really important, and learning from other people. I remember we went and we saw Selma. I think that was back in 2015 or so. And growing up in school, I learned about Martin Luther King, but I did not learn the extent. I did not know about the church bombing. I didn't know about what happened at Selma. So I felt like that was really, really eye-opening. And I think that seeing that movie with you, it really kind of put me in your shoes maybe a little bit, if I could say that. I imagine that's obviously a stretch to make that.
You mean from like the viewpoint of the movie, right?
Yeah.
Like the perspective it gave you. That's fair. And I remember like bringing that up to some Chilean friends too about watching Selma, and they're like, "Oh, what's it about?" I'm like, "Civil rights movement in the U.S." We're like, "Oh, well, what about it? Like, the ones that I talked to didn't know much about it, which to me was appalling." And then I was like, "Okay, that's right. I'm in another country." So then I would just give like an abbreviated version of the civil rights movement, which is not easy to do. But I was like, okay. And then I'd say, here, you need to read this book. You need to read more about this person and so and so. But that was shocking to me. I was like, wait, you don't know?
I was
they know Martin Luther King, but yeah. So,
I was surprised. Yeah, like people they didn't really seem to have any idea. And I mean, I guess that I thought, that people would know more about it than they did. Jose Luis, did you learn about that in school, or like did you learn much about civil rights in the United States growing up in going to a Chilean school?
Not really, not really. I mean, probably we talked about it, but let's say as we do with other, let's say, really important events, but we didn't, let's say, really study that, and that's why, let's say, in a way, let's say we also experience racism here. Let's say that, I mean, actually, I can hear some protests going on right now because people against the government, and what people do here, at 8 o'clock or at 9, start, hitting or just banging pots. So I can just hear back. I can just hear that in let's say in my back. So let's say in that way, I think, yeah, that's why, let's say we discussed this with Daniel, like the idea of educating ourselves, because this is a movement that I remember when people were really shocked when, what just happened to George Floyd, but then I would just ask my friends, but this also happens here, with our indigenous peoples or, with people from other countries. So it's like, how is it so shocking? Because, yeah, I mean, we need to discuss that. And I think we don't usually do that, like you said, but we need to start at some point. And also that's why that's the point of having, let's say, this conversation with Daniel and you, Tina, like how we can learn from each other, and because we have all, let's say, different backgrounds, and let's say, and also because when we work with people, we need to try to also help them, educate themselves, like to find other perspectives. When I've been reading a lot about that, and then you're like, whoa, I didn't know this, or I didn't know that. And that's why this is so powerful. Again, it also shares lots of resources with me. So, and I think we're all learning. This is the process that, let's say, stage that we're all trying to learn as much as we can.
And I will say that these are all controversial topics, right? The protests going on in Chile and the Black Lives Matter movement. I think I've only seen once when I've seen a civil conversation via Facebook comments regarding these events. I personally don't engage online, even if I think someone's out of line. If I do want to approach the person, I'll either send a direct message or I'll call them. For me, it just evolves. There's no respect. It's just out the window. And these are people that know each other, right? Because you're Facebook friends to a certain extent. So that's just something that I decided to just not engage in, is online conversations. And I still have a lot of Chilean friends, so I see both sides of the spectrum. And if I have questions, I engage directly with the person, like, hey, so what does this mean? And granted, I'm an outsider, but they have no problem sharing the information with me. And I just think that that's just kind of the best practices from what I've seen in my experience with people.
To say, maybe discuss it. You're going to hear different sides, And also, I think, it's kind of like when people say, like when people ask me what's happening in Chile, and I'd say, well, it's really just difficult to just say, like maybe in a couple of sentences, this goes back, I don't know, more than 40 years, So it would be really just difficult this is what's happening. It would be just to simplify it. And I guess, let's say, let's say for you, Tina, it's, let's say, more difficult because this has been going on for so long, so you can just say, like, what's happening? Woof. I can give you 10 books, maybe more, to try to explain what's been happening in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, it's not 40 years. It's what, 400 years?
I mean, I was thinking about Chile, let's say, in terms of the 40 years, in terms of the dictatorship.
Yes, the founding of the country, really.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking when I said that, 40 years.
Black Lives Matter. Yeah. 40. Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. 40 years there.
Yeah, 40 years in Chile, 400 in the United States. Yeah. Very good. So, I did have one last question. So, Jose Luis and I, we've been educating ourselves by watching documentaries, reading about the use of language and racism, learning about U.S. history, things that we maybe didn't learn before. And I was wondering if you have any specific resources or recommendations that English teachers could use with students in Chile, or English teachers could use that are living outside the United States to educate themselves about the civil unrest in the United States, racism, or things that they could share with their students.
I generally respond with interviews with James Baldwin because I think he's very eloquent. I think as far as he has interviews, he does say it, he tells it like it is. So I think for teachers, they can look at these interviews and choose which clips they want to share with their students, because there are clips you can share. However, the history of racism in the United States is not pretty. And as far as introducing a Chilean student, for example, who doesn't really have the background on it, it's a very layered topic. And so there's certain interviews that I would share, but not all of them. So that is my caveat as far as James Baldwin goes. But he's also a writer. He's not just an interviewee, and a poet as well. So I think his book, Native Son, I would totally encourage that. To students, can totally read that. And I remember that book was part of the curriculum when I was like 6th, 7th grade. So as far as students go, like that's a book that I would recommend. There have been a lot of books on anti-racism, but I have not personally read them, which is why I didn't really want to advocate for them. But I personally have been rewatching a lot of material and documentaries on James Baldwin, and I recommended a specific YouTube video, and when he debates, it's like a famous debate that he had at Cambridge University, and it's 55 minutes, but it's so good and it's so heavy and it's so impactful. And I think that is something that you could actually break up in 3 different classes with a student, because they will see both sides of the argument and they can decide for themselves of what they want to believe. But when both arguments are presented, it's kind of hard to, one way or the other. And even at the end of the video, you'll see the reception that he got from the Cambridge University students. So that's something I like to, when I make recommendations to people on this, I like to keep it really simple. So that's why I'm just sticking with James Baldwin. I know there's so much out there that if people want to Google more, if you want to read more Zora Neale Hurston, if you were to Google James Baldwin or similar names, you can easily put that in a search bar and you would find it. But I'd rather stick with what I wholeheartedly support, and I wholeheartedly support what he says. Even the disturbing things, because there's still a reason why he's saying that, right? And just a quote that I wanted to leave you guys with as far as from James Baldwin is that I can't believe what you say because I see what you do. And that's something that it's something that's it's something that is so eloquent that I wouldn't be able to say it myself with the way my command of the English language, but I wholeheartedly support. And so that's something that I've had in the back of my mind as far as these Facebook conversations go and things of that nature. It's like, you can say something, but your actions will prove otherwise. So that would be my recommendation for English teacher and students.
Great. So we're going to share that source. We're going to share that in our show notes for sure. So thank you, Tina, for that resource.
Okay, so that wraps up our first ever video episode with an interview. Tina, thank you so much for being our guest. It was wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right.
It was great. Really insightful. And we just have to keep learning, keep reading, keep educating ourselves, But this is, it was a really good conversation. So thank you very much, Tina.
Excellent.